Wondering what the F has happened to your body and your life? You're in the right place, my friend. Welcome to Season 3 of Transforming 45, where we dive into the incredible stories of how brilliant humans are navigating the midlife squeeze with courage, passion, and a healthy dose of humor. Don't miss out on any of our heart-led episodes. Hit the subscribe button, leave a 5-star review, and if you're inspired, share an episode you love with a friend. It means more to me than I can express that you're choosing to spend time here and sharing our message of midlife revolution. So let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Transforming 45. I have really been looking forward to this conversation since we had our initial chat. So today I am really excited to welcome Eric Collett. He is the CEO of A Mind for All Seasons, an innovative company specializing in helping to optimize their cognitive and mental health. He is a nationally recognized speaker, consultant, and brain health expert, a licensed residential care administrator, a teacher at the College of Western Idaho, and has also taught at Boise State University. Eric passionately believes that lifelong learning is a key to finding powerful new solutions to significant challenges and has been working to change lives through innovative brain health interventions, program development, and leadership strategies since 2000. We know that there is so much transition that is happening in our brains at this midlife, perimenopause, menopausal transition. So I cannot wait to get into this conversation. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here today.
Oh, I'm so eager to have the conversation. I just loved our last conversation.
Well, for all my regular viewers and listeners, they know how much I love listening and talking about the brain. As a former educator, it is always fascinating to me. I shouldn't say former. I still am an educator, just in a different way. And so the brain is always so fascinating to me. So yeah, this is going to be a really great and meaningful conversation. So Eric, tell us, who are you and how did life introduce you to this version?
Well, first of all, I love that question. And I've actually shared it with several other people since I heard that in listening to some of your other interviews. But I would say overall, I'm a lifelong learner. I'm just somebody who really is curious. And I'm not entirely sure how life introduced me to that version of myself because it's always been that way. When I was a little kid, I drove my mother. I don't know how she had the patience to deal with it because I would go to school and I would learn whatever was the subject of the day and the things that we were talking about. And I would literally come running home, burst through the door and say, "Mom, guess what?" And I think it took me until I was a young adult, at least, to recognize that that was a really good way to learn, that by teaching someone else, I was cementing in that knowledge. But I don't ever remember anything conscious where I decided to do that. And it's been a fun ride. I think when you're a lifelong learner and you start really trying to prioritize constantly learning every day and looking for ways to grow, life never really gets stagnant. And everything is an opportunity to learn. Every person that you're with is an opportunity to learn from. I flew back from a conference that I spoke at in Iowa just yesterday. And from Denver back home to Boise, Idaho, where I live, I was sitting next to this soccer coach from New Mexico. And we immediately struck up a conversation. We just chatted the whole way. And I learned so much from him. And I think he probably learned a few things from me too, because we were talking about concussive injuries and how they might affect his athletes. But he had really varied experience, and I love that. So life, I would say, didn't so much introduce me to that version of myself as much as it just keeps reintroducing me over and over and over to the joy of being curious in life.
Yes, this is something that I find very, very interesting, and that is curiosity. And are we born as natural curious beings? And how do some people stay connected to that curiosity? And then there are some that don't. And how do we continue to build that curiosity? Like if we've been disconnected from it in some way, how do we come back to it how do we work at building curiosity if somewhere along the way something happened that disconnected us from that?
I think there are a lot of insightful questions or answers or responses to something like you just brought up. But a few things come to mind. One of the things that I've learned as I've gotten older is that my success in so many things in life, whether it's relationships or business or anything, really has to do with asking better questions. And if someone's disconnected from their curiosity, learning to ask better questions, which really involves practicing and paying attention, I think is a really good place to start. It's one of the reasons that I love that initial question that you ask your guests, because that's a different twist on a question that a lot of people get asked. Hey, who are you? What do you do? But to ask a better question unlocks a lot of things. And so I think if a person even sits back and says, well, what questions am I asking? Am I questioning anything? Maybe start with, why is the sky blue? If you don't know the answer to that, there really is an answer and you can go find it and you will appreciate some things in the world that much more. So asking better questions is one. And the second thing that I'd say is practice being a really astute observer. People think, for example, that listening is just a passive activity and that we just sit back and what people don't pay attention to is their mental white space. Because we kind of have two conversations going on all the time. There's the one that we think that we're engaged in, and then there's that mental white space, which is like the little mind's playground, and we're wandering off thinking about something that happened this morning or some project that we have coming up later on. But listening is actually the most active thing that we can do as humans. And the way to control the mental white space is to actually listen very intently and to observe. Most of communication is indirect. It's tone, it's pitch, it's pacing, it's why did they use that specific word for this thing? Does that tell me something? And so if we're not naturally connected to our curiosity, making an intentional effort to be a better observer and to really see people around us, combined with asking questions, I think unlocks so much for all of us. And even if it's not about observing people, it's observing things that are happening around us. It might be something happening in the backyard. Recently, my wife had a project with a bunch of girls from our church, and she was putting together this camp. And the girls decided that they wanted to have the metaphor of a butterfly changing. So, caterpillar becoming butterfly as sort of the guide for them changing and growing into adult women and all of the things that could be learned from that. And so we got a bunch of butterflies. Well, we got a bunch of caterpillars and we watched them change. And as much as I love science and I love to learn, I had never actually watched that process. And it was absolutely fascinating. And there, I mean, I don't want to derail our conversation, go down and talk about caterpillars becoming butterflies. But if you've never done something that simple, just get a couple of caterpillars and watch them transform and you will reconnect with the child that's in you. Because back to one of your earlier statements, and you probably have seen this because you taught children for so many years. I think children, I think all of us by nature are just naturally curious because we have to be. That's how we grow. That's how we develop as humans.
Absolutely. And I actually want to use that metaphor of the caterpillars and this midlife transition because much earlier in this season in the fall, I had on a really incredible woman who was talking about what happens in the chrysalis. And in the chrysalis, the caterpillar actually dissolves into this goo that's called imaginal cells. And then that goo, the imaginal cells, reconfigure themselves into the butterfly. And I love that metaphor for this midlife time. And it also connects to those questions, right? If we can let ourselves dissolve into the imaginal cells, that imaginal space, and start asking ourselves the question of what do I really want and who am I now? which is why I ask that part about how did life introduce you to this version? Because I think we're always in the state of becoming. We're always sort of in this place of transition. And so I wanted to make space for that. And listening, getting back to what you were saying about really listening, about really letting ourselves sit in that goo space and imagining and asking ourselves the questions that perhaps we haven't had the opportunity to ask since we were children, when we were in that space of curiosity and creativity and imagining and dreaming. I think that's what makes this time so powerful, is that we can do that. We can let ourselves sit in that imaginal goo and imagine what comes next.
I love that. And I just learned something. I had no idea that caterpillars did that inside the chrysalis. I'd never heard of imaginal glue, so now I've got to go look that up. The nerd in me is just nerding out over this. This is so much fun.
Yeah.
But as you described that, Lisa, and I was really trying to lean in and listen to that and think about how does that apply in my life? My mind was called back to early in 2020 when the pandemic hit. And just for context, prior to that, so in 2016, I started A Mind for All Seasons. I'd spent 16 years running assisted living and memory care communities, and I saw, hey, there's a better way. We can do more. And there's a whole story that maybe we'll get into, maybe we won't, about quitting my day job, taking a flying leap, starting this company so that we can make a bigger difference for people and help individuals improve their brain health. And initially, we had gone all in to helping people in assisted living, independent living, skilled nursing facilities, so very elderly people, reverse symptoms of cognitive decline to one degree or another by really focusing on root cause issues that lead to cognitive decline. And we were having lots of success with it. And we had opened a new location. So we opened a brain therapy studio as kind of a proof of concept and training location for some of our assisted living partners to be able to come to and get guidance and training. We had hired new staff. We had started to take on local clients in the Boise, Idaho area. And things were amazing. And when 2020 started, I thought, hey, this is like the year of perfect vision. We're going to have 2020 vision this year. I had big goals, big aspirations, big dreams. And then they all came crashing down in an instant. Our office had to close for a short period of time. But what stayed closed for a long period of time was almost all the clients that we were working with. We literally lost 3/4 of our revenue, bam, overnight. And I think sometimes when I look at the many women, the thousands of women that we've served in the last 9 years or so, I think when they hit midlife, it feels like things come crashing down when a lot of these women start going through perimenopause and menopause. It feels like everything that they had known, everything that they could rely upon just stops in one way or another. And it's devastating. And it was hard when things just shut down. I didn't take a paycheck for the better part of a year. We had hired new staff and they needed the work and I wanted them to have the work and they were amazing people and I wanted them on the team. And I said, we'll find a way to pay you. And we did. I'm really proud of the fact that we did. But I was the only one coming into the office. And getting back to the earlier comment I made about asking good questions, I sat in my office looking out the window at the golf course behind me, thinking, okay, what are the best questions that I could be asking right now? And I knew that one of them was not, why is this happening to me? That wasn't going to be productive. And I don't think it's productive for women hitting midlife to be asking, why is this happening to me? Well, it is happening. It's reality. And the reality for me in that moment was we lost 3/4 of our revenue. But here's the most impactful question I asked during that time. It was, what would have to be true for me to look back and say that the COVID pandemic was the absolute best thing that happened to A Mind for All Seasons? And as I sat there and thought about it for, I think, more than a day, eventually an answer came. It was an idea, and it was like someone spoke in my mind, and the words were, cast your net on the other side of the boat. And I knew what that meant. What that meant was we had already recognized and had begun working with younger people, because as we were having success with people that had Alzheimer's disease, in some cases, they went from scores of 15 out of 30 to 30 out of 30 on a cognitive test, which they were not cured, believe me, but they were so much more functional that they could pass a dementia screener test. So they were doing better. We changed the trajectory. But their adult children started saying, "Hey, you just helped my mom improve in major ways. What could you do for me? I was in a car wreck 2 years ago and my brain's never been the same. Could you help me?" And we had started doing some of that work and we saw the possibilities. We knew that pivots would come and that we would build out a private client services line. And so when I had the idea, cast your net on the other side of the boat, I realized we need to go all in and build that service line now because we can't serve elderly adults right now. And so we did. And that's allowed us to serve people from teenagers on up through middle to late adulthood. And we have clients scattered all over the United States. And increasingly, people in other countries are reaching out and saying, "Can you help me?" That never would have happened without the pandemic. And I think so many women, as they're going through menopause, when they have the guidance of someone like you or some of the other amazing coaches out there and the voices that are saying, well, to borrow the words of one of my friends, menopause doesn't have to suck.
Mhm.
Kind of that's a crass way to put it, but it doesn't have to, but it's the butterfly effect. It's not the butterfly effect. It's becoming
It's the
something
goo.
different. It's the goo. It's
Mhm.
the transformation. And it's asking the question, how can I take this thing that is so hard, but use it as fuel to become something so much more than I already am? How do I take all the good that I have and build and move forward?
Yeah. There's 1,000 things that I wanna pull out of what you just said, but there's 2 I'm gonna focus on. So 1, I think that casting your net on the other side and looking at younger humans, it's what we need to be doing more of, is looking at our entire lifespan and doing that intergenerational learning. That just because I am in this age bracket doesn't mean I don't connect to and don't have information to both share and learn from. So, which also takes me to when you're asking that question for women who are perimenopausal, like, why is this happening to me? Were we to have the information when we are younger and understand our brains at that level and know this is what is going to happen to my brain over the next few decades, so that when I hit perimenopause, I don't have to ask that question of what is happening to me because I know. And there's what is happening at this point is that hasn't happened. So women who are of this generation, Gen X particularly, and all the women who came before, we didn't have the knowledge to know what was happening. So we hit this space and all of the way our bodies' communication systems have worked are no longer working, but we don't know why. And so then there's this fear. I cannot tell you how many women, when I'm doing a professional learning session, have come up to me afterwards and said, "Lisa, I thought I was in the early stages of dementia." It's probably the comment I hear. It makes me emotional because it's probably the comment I hear the most during those sessions. And I see one of my favorite things about doing this work is that I watch women's faces change. They come in and I can see the fear, I can see the stress and tension. I can see all of that on their bodies because they don't understand what's going on with them. And as we go through and they learn, their faces start to change and they settle into themselves because now they understand. They're making connections of it's brain fog. It's not the early stages of dementia. And there is something I can do about this when the messages they've been given is, well, you're aging, you're getting older. That's just the way it is now. And that is not the truth. So having this knowledge, right? Knowledge is power. Knowing what's happening and knowing it for our lifespans is what gives us the ability to really look at root causes of things.
So true. And I love how you framed all of that. That was very well said. And it calls to mind a lesson that I learned from a young woman who is now in her mid 20s, but when we worked with her, she was, this was several years ago. And I learned a lesson that I've used over and over and over. And I think it sums up what you just described. She had a bipolar diagnosis. She was severely depressed and suicidal. And really, she had undiagnosed post concussion syndrome. And she had some genetic issues. She had an MTHFR genetic problem, and she had some nutrient and hormonal issues that were going on. And it took a while to sort through all of that. And then it took another year to figure out ultimately another issue that was causing her to just cyclically have these depressive moments. And we can get into what that was, and because it's pretty fascinating. But to get to the point of the lesson that I learned from her, until we figured out that last piece of the puzzle for her, she was no longer suicidal. She had improved dramatically. She was able to go back to college, and she was starting to date again, and life was looking up for the most part, but she was still cyclical. She still had off weeks until we figured out what was causing that. And I remember being on a call with her one day, and she was not having the best week, but she didn't seem so rattled. When I very first met her and she came to the office, she sat across the desk from me, and I asked her to tell me a little bit more about what was going on, and she couldn't even talk. I literally sat there for 20 minutes, and I just said, "I know this is hard, but I'm here for you, and I'll wait as long as it takes." And it was 20 minutes, but then she started to share a few things, and we were able to go from there. And I noticed in this later interview, she wasn't so rattled, and I called it out. I said, "Even though you're struggling a little bit this week, it doesn't seem to be affecting you so much. Help me understand that. How did you get to this space?" And she said, "Eric, I've come to recognize that how I feel is different than who I am. I've learned not to confuse what I'm feeling with who I am. What I'm feeling is a symptom. And right now, I don't like how I feel, and I don't have to like how I feel, but I know what it feels like to be having a really good day or a really good week. And I know that that's possible. And so I know this is just a symptom." And it turns out it really was just a symptom. We were able to figure that out. It just took us another year. And now we get there faster with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's so important of making that distinction between symptoms being who I am and how I feel, because we can get really bogged down in the symptomology of what's happening and feeling like, well, that's who I am now. When really that is not who you are. Your body's talking to you. There are messages coming to you from your body telling you what needs some extra attention and care. But when we do separate that out from, like, I am not my symptoms, I am still this incredible human being that I have always been. And when I listen to the symptoms coming from my body, I can change the way I'm feeling. And I want to come back to that, but I wanted also to talk. This is going to feel like a bit of a left turn for a second. And when you offered to the young woman who was sitting in your office, "I know this is hard, but I am here for you." That, listeners, is language that you can give to your partners, because having conversation with our partners about what is shifting and changing in our bodies and in our life context can be really challenging. So I'm wondering, how do you have conversation with your partner? Because you and I talked, we have very similar sort of life patterns, and the conversations that you have with your partner are very similar to the ones that I'm able to have with mine. And I know that that is not necessarily the case with everyone. So how do you approach your partner in a way that allows her to feel seen and supported?
Thank you for that question. I've spent the last 26 years of marriage trying to get better at just that. And I think what's helped me the most is to understand emotion a lot better. Now, I did study interpersonal and group communication as an undergraduate. That was a huge area of focus. I've been interested in people for a long, long time. But I'm so much better at this than I used to be, because I've come to understand that most of us, when it comes to others' emotions and our own emotions, tend to do two things that are unproductive, or they're at least less effective. We tend to categorize and judge emotion, and we should on ourselves and others. I shouldn't be feeling this. You shouldn't be feeling that. This is bad emotion. This is good emotion. So we're categorizing all the time, and then we're judging it as whether we should or shouldn't be feeling that. And I've come to learn that we have emotions because we have neurotransmitters and we have hormones and we have an experience. It gets filtered through beliefs, attitudes, prior values, neuroanatomy, habits, lots of different things, but it ultimately pops out the other end as a neurochemical hormonal thing called a feeling. And in the moment that you're feeling it, it's real. It's a physiological experience. And Lisa, if you had a broken femur and you were in a full leg cast, but I know that you love snow skiing like I do, if I walked up to you and I said, Lisa, take the stupid cast off. We're going skiing. It's all in your head. Come on. Well, obviously, you would question my sanity. But I'm sure that you and everybody listening has been upset at some point, and you've had a human walk up to you and say, now just calm down. And to me, I think that is so invalidating. It doesn't help somebody. And I think it comes from a place of insecurity on the part of the person that's saying that. And instead of categorizing and judging emotion, I think we can learn to observe and label it. And I think most of us just want to be seen. We want to be heard. We don't want someone to try to fix everything for us because we need to learn how to face things as humans. We need to do hard things, but it's really helpful to know that we're not alone in it. And I've gotten better over the last 26 years at seeing what's really going on with my wife and saying, you seem frustrated. Do you want to talk about it? And sometimes she says, no, actually, I think I just want to go for a walk right now with you. Great, let's do it. And other times it's, yeah, can you just let me get it out? Can you be a sounding board? Absolutely. And I don't have to try to talk her off the ledge with something. It's okay to feel. That's the core of being a human. And I'm so grateful that we have these bodies that allow us to feel and to have that experience. I think part of what has allowed me to shift in that way is intentional effort, but a big part of it has also been the work that I've done at A Mind for All Seasons, because I have literally seen people who were rude, abrasive, accusatory, where everything was everyone else's fault. It was never their fault. And earlier in my life, I would have categorized and judged them as just the jerks of the world. And I have watched those people transform. I have seen people who had, like one 70-year-old man came to us about 5 years ago. And ultimately, as we sorted through everything going on, that he had been really kind, very friendly. He had lots and lots of friends earlier. But ultimately, his wife of decades divorced him. His adult kids wouldn't talk to him. He lost his friends, and he was a jerk. I mean, when we started working with him, he blamed me for everything that went wrong, and I was regretting working with him. Ultimately, we found that he had mercury levels in the 99th percentile because when he became very wealthy as a land developer, that success allowed him to do a lot more things in life, and that included eating whatever he wanted. And he loved to eat ahi tuna sushi, so he did that every day. And he had a compromised detox pathway through the liver. And what most people could probably clear out just fine built up in him, and he developed Mad Hatter's disease. In the same way that hat makers lost their minds earlier in
Right.
history because they used mercury in the hat making process, he had mercury built up. And he had a tremor that he couldn't control, and he couldn't make a fist with his right hand, and he was a jerk. Or at least that's how most people would label it. And I literally, over the course of 9 months, watched him transform and become his true self again. And to this day, I consider him a friend. Every now and then we still talk. He's out traveling the world. And when you see people transform like that and become a better version of themselves, I think it changes what you see. And so, whether it's with my wife or another human being, when things aren't going very well, I view it more as a symptom. If my wife doesn't get about 30 grams of protein first thing in the morning, she's hangry and her brain doesn't work as well. And she's not loving how she's feeling in that moment. And occasionally I have to step in and say, honey, let's just eat something. Yeah, good idea. And like 5 minutes after she starts eating, she says, thank you. I feel so much better. I feel like myself again. So what we feel is a symptom.
Oh, absolutely. It just as a funny aside, when we travel, my husband always, especially in the mornings, he always has a emergency protein bars for exactly this reason, because he knows if we're traveling, maybe it takes a little bit longer to eat in the morning, and he knows that I need to have something. Or same, hangry. I am excessively hangry. And the root cause aspect that runs through everything you were saying, both physically and emotionally, I think is something for listeners to reflect on for themselves, but also to share with their partners. Listen to this conversation with your partner, because it's that instead of, as you said, jumping into blame or shame or judgment, we look at what's happening in front of us. So if I think about it in my own context, if I get to a point where I am just ragey, right? And it, for whatever reason, it could be the shoes that have been left in the hallway, and I've been cleaning up after everybody all day long. And there's been, a buildup of a lot of things. And suddenly I have this moment of explosion. The communication works best when Ken, who is my husband, instead of getting into that rage with me, he will say, "What's going on? What's up? Tell me about what your day was like." And that it's that open space of being seen, being heard, not being judged, and not being told I shouldn't feel what I'm feeling. There's a reason I'm feeling that way. Part of it is biological, and that I have less energetic space for dealing with the myriad of things that I would have before, because what's happening in my body is so energy expensive. So there's that element of it. And then there is the real life context of constantly being in service of other people all day long, and then just having a breaking point. But that open communication of I see you, and I'm going to hold what you're feeling. And the other thing I really appreciated was when you said, "Do you want to talk about it?" Right? "I see you're frustrated. Do you want to talk about it?" Because that opens it up and gives options for, yes, I want to talk about it right now. I do want to talk about it eventually, but not right now. It gives us options, which is really what we need, right? Is choice and choosing how we engage or when we engage. And so I think that seeing through the lens of symptoms, like what I'm seeing in front of me, regardless of it being physical, emotional, whatever, it's a symptom. And I'm not going to judge it from my own perspective, but I'm going to ask some kind and open-ended questions.
Yeah. As you were talking there, Lisa, one other thought came to mind as far as a framework that I think allows us to find better questions. But in itself, it is a question. I think most of us, when we interact with others, are doing so on the basis of what we think is deserved. What's just here? What's deserved? It's a completely different thing to ask the question, what would be helpful? So, for example, I have 4 children, 2 girls, 2 boys, and 3 of them are adults, and our baby is 16. So they're all older. But when one of my boys was younger, he would get really stuck emotionally, and he would just not quite be raging, but really frustrated and irritated. And you could hardly talk to him. And I would ask him things like, "Hey, what's going on?" or "What's wrong?" "I don't know. It's stupid." And it felt like I was talking to a brick wall. And I'm sure I'm probably not the only parent that's ever felt that. And I needed to learn, and largely through my wife's help and her good insight and instincts, she helped me recognize that in those moments, he's feeling insecure, and what he really needs to be able to open up and talk about it is to feel loved. And so instead of talking about what's happening on the surface and trying to get him to calm down, we would just say things like, "I know this is really hard right now, but you just need to know that we love you." And sometimes just giving him a hug and saying, "You seem so frustrated. Do you just need a hug?" No joke. He, like, even as a teenager, man, the tears would start to come and he would just melt. And he would give you a big hug and he'd cry a little bit and he'd say, "I just don't know what's going on. I'm so frustrated. I can't see my way through this." But it got him going. He would start talking. And the only way that you get to something like that is by asking what would be helpful, because sometimes his behavior was rude. It was abrasive. Sometimes he would say things that were demeaning. And he was a really, really good kid growing up, by the way. But we all have our moments. When he'd have these moments, if I interacted based on what was deserved, it was always building the wall higher, and it was just a thicker wall to run into. But the quickest way to tear it down was to just give him what he really needed, which was a hug and a little bit of space and some emotional support, and then he could get through it.
Yeah. And that is the same recipe of what we need at this stage as well. It's that same structure of communication, which again takes us back to, so that gives us space to get to the root cause. And so I also want to ask, so for so many of us who are experiencing brain fog and word recall issues and all of the neurological components that come along with perimenopause and menopause, what is the root cause of why that is happening?
That's a great question. And I think at the outset, I have to say, brain health is never about one thing. It's always multimodal. And I don't want to be cavalier and say, this is the root cause, because it's different for everyone. And it's never just one thing. But I think there are a lot of things that are helpful for people to understand. Certainly, hormones are involved. And I think a lot of women need to understand that 2 out of 3 Alzheimer's patients are women, statistically, because the longer you live without the nourishing supportive hormones, the more your brain can't function. Roughly 40% of what so-called sex hormones do is reproductive, but the other 60% is brain health and bone health. And I think we fail to appreciate just how neurologically active these hormones are. This was just a recent experience. So we have this whole program on the professional services side of what we do, where healthcare professionals can bring cases of people they are serving and say, hey, here's what's going on. We're observing these types of behaviors. Here's the medication list. Here's the health history. Here's the diagnoses, et cetera. And we workshop those cases. So just a few months ago, some skilled nursing professionals in North Carolina talked about a resident who moved into their facility just a few weeks before this. And she was a retired airline flight attendant supervisor. So she was used to being in charge, and she was not sleeping. She was up all night, which that's not that uncommon, but she was really distressed and going into other residents' rooms, trying to get them out of their rooms. She was going to evacuate them from the building. Well, that's kind of a problem. And so the staff did something that was relatively logical. They just went around, they locked everybody else's doors. And by the time they came to our review session and submitted this case, they said, Eric, she's broken off 2 doorknobs trying to get to these people. She's that desperate to get in. Well, Randy, our medical director, listened to that and he said, you know, the biggest issue here, if we were to prioritize things, is that this woman is not sleeping. And we all become kind of psychotic when we don't sleep. Even one 24-hour period without sleep will just wreck us as humans. That's why militaries use sleep deprivation as a form of torture. So he said, rather than throwing a sleeping pill at this elderly woman, it's contraindicated, you shouldn't use those medications. And in just the last 2 months, research has come out showing that things like Ambien actually prevent the brain from getting into some of the stages of sleep where the waste can truly be removed from the brain. So, hey, let's not do that. He said the reason that she's struggling to sleep is because she's lived so long without sufficient progesterone in her system that it's virtually non-existent. And I don't need to do a blood test to know that she has hardly any progesterone in her body. Well, progesterone binds to GABA receptors. That means it's very calming. And he talked to her doctor and said, why don't we do a little trial of some bioidentical progesterone? So he recommended 100 milligrams of prometrium, a specific bioidentical progesterone, every night. And let's see if that calms her and that helps her sleep. In the same way that when someone's going through menopause, and lots of women start struggling with sleep because of this depletion of progesterone, In that same way that using some progesterone in a woman that's in her 50s might be helpful, what about this woman in her 80s? Well, I got an email from the memory care director just a couple of weeks later, and she said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Collett. Just want to report what's going on here." And this woman had literally gone from up at night, breaking into residents' rooms, to now she sleeps all night. She attends activities. She's giving the staff hugs instead of taking a swing at them. She's eating all of her meals. She still has a few minor triggers, but the staff just understand what those are, and they meet her where she is. And just that one thing helped her do so much better. And that's not an isolated case. I'm not suggesting that progesterone is the answer for every elderly woman that's struggling in this, or we've even done this with men, but it's one tool in the toolbox. So I think that illustrates just how important even paying attention to one of these factors could be. I have literally watched elderly patients who couldn't talk start putting words together again when we did some very modest hormone replacement with them. And it's not just about estrogen or progesterone or testosterone. It's also about very neurologically active hormones like pregnenolone and DHEA, luteinizing hormone, growth hormone, these types of things. There are many, many different neurologically active hormones. So let me pause there, Lisa, because that's just a little conversation about hormones, but there's some other things that we could unpack. But let me just pause and see if you have any follow-up to that.
Yeah, it's such a powerful story because it really highlights what can happen when we actually look at the individual, think about their whole self, their lived experiences, who they were, what we know of them generally, how this behavior is different. When we look at the whole picture of them, and again, look at the root cause rather than treating a symptom. Like you said, it would have been really easy to give her sleep medication, which perhaps would have masked that. But then whatever is going on is going to show up in another way, which is what we see happen now. We put medication on to treat one symptom, and then something else pops up. And then we need a medication for that. And then we need a medication for that. And that's how we end up with all of these incredibly complex medication scenarios that people find themselves in, rather than looking at the totality of the human being and searching down for what is the root cause, right? What do we need to look at first? And that is so powerful for women at this vote, for all humans to know, and for women specifically at this stage to know, is that when you are advocating for yourself, that is some of the language you can use, right? I want to get to the root cause of why I am feeling this way. And I'm going to advocate as much as I need to get to that place rather than just slapping on a symptom or slapping on a medication to treat a symptom. So thank you for sharing that because it's really important information.
Yeah. I want to add one idea to that concept of getting to the root cause, because I think many people start realizing that, and it even makes logical sense. Of course, we'd want to get to the root cause of things. And many people start looking for practitioners that can help them do just that and sort through things. But there's a caution out there, and it's something that I've observed for years. The caution is this: many healthcare providers who talk about getting to the root cause also fall prey to very human tendencies. Regardless of how many letters we have after our names, we're still humans, and there are certain tendencies that we slip into. And one of them is confirmation bias, or sort of seeing things through the lens that we have experienced and assuming that it's that way for me, it must be that way for everyone else. So in the functional medicine world, often a practitioner comes to that mindset because they themselves had some sort of a health problem that they couldn't solve with more diagnose and medicate sort of mentality. And so they were looking for answers. And what I see is that you have some providers out there that see everything through the lens of gut health. And that's really what they focus on. And others, everything is about mold and mycotoxins. And others, it's always about heavy metals, and on and on and on. And I think what people really need is personalized medicine. Every single human system is unique, and it ought to be deeply humbling to any of us who are trying to be helpful. How many factors do you think there are that make you, you, and me? If you had to pick a number, could
Gosh,
you even begin?
yeah, I feel like it could be infinite.
Yeah, like, I agree. Where do you even start? But
Mhm.
even just looking at genetic factors and environmental factors, I think most people would say, yeah, there's more than 52. But let's take 52 because that's how many cards are in a deck of cards. And really the question is, how many unique shuffles of the deck are there? How many ways could we shuffle 52 variables before there'd be a repeat you or me? Well, the answer is 52 factorial, which is 52 times 51 times 50 on down to 1. And if you do that crazy big math problem, I don't even know what you call the answer, but there are a number of good analogies for it. Here's one of them. If every shuffle was a grain of sand, you could fill the Grand Canyon nearly 4 times before there would be a repeat. In other words, if you look back through entire human history, there hasn't been enough time for there to be a repeat shuffle. And even if you take the estimated age of the universe, if you go with astronomers and what they say about that, it hasn't been around long enough for there to be a repeat shuffle. So literally, there's no one like you, there's no one like me. That's why every single human life absolutely matters at the deepest possible level. And that's why we should be really humble when we try to help anybody because their system is completely unique. And even though there are principles that generally apply, and we can talk about those principles, what people really need is personalized medicine. It's not conventional, it's not functional. It's why do you have these symptoms and what collection of stuff is contributing to that? We're all doing an N of one experiment. And we are the stewards over our bodies, and no one will ever care about your body as much as you do, and no one will ever care about my body as much as I do, because we're the ones that get to live in these bodies of ours. So, what can we do to sort through all of those individualized factors for ourselves?
You are speaking directly to my soul. I believe this with every fiber of my being, and I see it play out over and over and over again. I learn so much from every well, one, going back, I learned so much from every child because not only is medicine this way, but education should be this way. Like all of the major institutions that we have in our society that are meant, for the average of which doesn't really exist, doesn't, and then so they end up not looking at the individual. And when we look at the individual, I can't tell you, like every child who came through the door of my classroom, I learned so much from each one of them about how to make myself better, about how to be better for the next young human that I interacted with. And the same is true now. Every woman I interact with, I am learning from that person and their journey, and that is exactly what we need. It is personalized medicine because we are so incredibly unique and different. And to give everybody sort of a bit of foundation that they can stand on as they're thinking through what is it that I specifically need? What are some of those foundational principles that can be helpful for most of us?
Love that question and the fact that you used the word foundational, because think of building a bridge. If you're trying to think of your bridge to better health, the place that you start with any bridge is the foundation. And the deeper you go, the bigger the bridge is that you can support. So a little footbridge has just a shallow foundation, but the Golden Gate Bridge or some other major bridge in the world, those pylons go deep into the ocean floor. So here's a list of foundational things that are just fundamental to our experience as humans. Here at A Mind for All Seasons, we use the acronym BEDS. And I'm not prioritizing these necessarily in a specific order. I could give some priority, but the acronym's easy to remember. So let's start with the B, which is brain training. If you want to have a better brain, you have to give it a reason to be more resilient and to be better and to form new synaptic connections. And people ask me all the time, well, does that mean I need to do Sudoku? And I said, well, if you want to be better at Sudoku, then practice Sudoku because you're going to get better at it. But to stimulate new synaptic connections and to really take care of your brain over time, you actually have to have novel experiences, new things. So that could be as simple as brush your teeth or eat with your non-dominant hand. It could be as simple as learn a language. It could be travel, but don't use your GPS to get everywhere. Form new mental maps. It could be doing something like bilateral asymmetry. The Japanese discovered in the early 2000s that elderly patients with dementia, if they did things that were different from one half of the body to the other at the same time, it stimulated growth, and their verbal fluency improved, their memory improved, even their gait and their ability to physically move around improved. And then the British Gymnastics Foundation saw that and said, well, we can do that too. So here's what bilateral asymmetry would look like. Very simplistically, if you're drawing sticks up and down, left hand, right hand doing opposite things, well, that's bilateral asymmetry. If you're drawing triangles, down, out, up, well, that's asymmetrical. But those things aren't hard for most people unless they have advanced disease. But what if you're drawing sticks with your left hand and triangles with the right hand? Now that's difficult. That I actually had to practice that. And at first, I felt like a child at it. I was all uncoordinated in my movement. But when I practiced it, I formed new connections and I got better at it. So that's brain training. E in beds reminds us about exercise. And there is nothing more important for stimulating brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a growth factor for brain cells, than exercise and fasting. Those two things are very, very powerful tools. And a lot of people want to exercise so they look good in a bathing suit. And it will have limited effect on that. Yeah, it'll help a little bit. But really, you exercise to keep your heart strong and to keep your brain working really well. We've got to have good blood flow through our system to be very functional. And sometimes people ask us, well, what's the best exercise to do? My business partner, Randy, our medical director, says, whatever you will stick with consistently throughout your life. So I love that answer. But to put a finer point on it, I think many women especially over prioritize cardiovascular workouts and they avoid strength training. And muscle cells have a higher concentration of mitochondria. And we need to keep our muscle as intact as possible as we're aging, or we're losing energy production. And when you consider that the brain is a hog, it uses 30%, 25 to 30% of all the calories that we're taking in go to producing energy in the brain. Well, if we have a drop in energy, we're going to be toast. So we don't want to do that. And muscle cells are also a bigger sink for glucose. So when you're going through menopause, especially, and you become more hormonally dysregulated for a period of time, the more muscle mass you have where you can store glycogen, the easier it's going to be for you. So lift heavy. I mean, work
Yes.
yourself up to it, warm up. Don't just go from being sedentary to trying to pick up some super heavy thing. Get some help if you need it, but learn to lift heavy things. So that's exercise. The first D, there are two of them. The first D is diet. And we could literally talk for the rest of the week about diet and not exhaust the topic. But there's a lot of tribalism out there. And I think it's important to leverage principles and not get stuck in tribalism. You will have people that advocate for a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet or a paleo diet or a carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet or, all these things. If anyone thinks that there is one diet that is perfect for every single human being with as many variables as we have, then they probably don't understand physiology very well.
Yeah, I want to pop in here for 1 second because I want to thank you very much for saying that. And when you were saying diet, like that's what I was going to say. You don't mean like one specific diet. You're talking about what we eat and how it fuels our body. And yeah, absolutely. There is not one diet that works for every single person. So thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Yes. So I think we get further when it comes to how we're fueling our bodies by just leveraging principles. So here's a few quick principles. One thing that everybody in the dietetics world can agree on is eat real food. Whatever you do, just all these chemistry experiments that masquerade as food that have been out for a few decades, they're killing us and they're introducing us to lots of chemicals that human bodies have never had to deal with. So if it's real, if it's in the form that you find it in nature, then it's generally good for food. That doesn't mean it's good for you necessarily, but that's a good place to start. So eat real food. Next, pay attention to the fact that food is fuel. And we need to fuel our bodies based upon our goal, which is another principle. So if we just ask ourselves, what's my goal? We arrive at different endpoints. For example, if we want to build muscle, we need a couple of things. We need protein, which is the building block of muscle, and we need an insulin response because muscle cells have insulin receptors. They don't have glucagon receptors, which break down cells because it's really not a good thing to break down muscle, and the body tries to avoid that. So if you go to the gym and you lift heavy and you do a great workout, and then 30 to 60 minutes afterward, you're eating something like some black rice and chicken thighs, you're going to have an insulin response because the rice, and you're going to have the protein from eating those chicken thighs. And I'm not saying that's the perfect meal. There's lots of things that you could do. It's also really important to focus on metabolic flexibility. Can your body burn fat when it's time to burn fat? Can you burn sugar when it's time to burn sugar? What's your fasting insulin level? It should be about 4 to 6. I see people all the time because we do blood work with people all over the place that have fasting insulin levels of 50. Their bodies are not sensitive at all to insulin signaling. You can't lose weight. If your goal is to lose weight, you can't lose weight if you're constantly provoking an insulin response because that's the signal to store. So just understanding those few things and asking yourself, how am I running the engine? What do I want to do here? And it might vary from one time of day to another. I eat really low carb during the workday because I want my sugars to be steady. And for my body, I feel really good when I do that. And when I'm sort of trending into a ketogenic state where my body's converting fat stores into ketones. But I don't want to lose weight. I'm actually at a very healthy weight for my age and my size and everything. So I liberalize my diet in the evening. I add some starches. I might have some potatoes or sweet potato or some rice or something so that I'm not really in ketosis all the time. So there's lots more that we could add to dietary strategies, but learn how to fuel your body in effective ways based on your goals and really look at what's working for you over time. The second D is dental health. And this is another one that we could talk about for a long, long time. But just know that a significant number of people who donate their brains to science and die of Alzheimer's disease are found to have P. gingivalis bacteria living in their brains. And your brain is a great big immune system. 50% or so of the cells by volume that make up the brain are immune cells of one sort or another. And when the immune system turns on, energy production drops. And what does that look like outwardly? Oh, if your frontal lobe isn't making good energy, then your reasoning, your planning, your judgment is off. You might have an attention deficit problem because the governor, the frontal lobe, can't do its job. You're not producing sufficient energy to stay focused. And dental health plays a really big role in that. And if we had more time, we could talk about some fascinating cases, even Parkinson's patients that really turned around, had a 95% reduction in symptoms by dealing with undiagnosed dental problems where that bacteria was leaching into their system, causing a chronic response. There are a couple of S's in the acronym BEDS, so I'll end with those. The first one is sleep. And if there's a lifestyle factor that's absolutely critical for human health, it's sleep. If you go one day without food, nothing bad happens. If you go one day without exercise, everybody's done it. Nothing bad happens, which is exactly why it's so hard to stay consistent because you can skip a day and nothing bad will happen. But if you don't exercise for decades, lots of bad stuff happens. But if you go for 24 hours without sleep, it wrecks you. You have to sleep to be superior. And I mean, if you want to, we can get into specifics of here's exactly what you do from a lifestyle standpoint to make sure that you're setting yourself up for good sleep. But prioritize your sleep. And then the last S is stress management. There's a lot of techniques that we could talk about, from box breathing or hypoxic breathing exercises to meditation and on and on. But the thing that I would point out about stress management is that many people experience stressors in their life of one sort or another that they can't necessarily control. We all get lifed on. It happens. But what people often forget to do is to counterbalance. If your stress is going up, then what are you intentionally doing to counterbalance? I think that alone makes a big difference for people. If they're feeling stressed, but they just take a few moments and sit back and say, well, how much higher is my stress today? And that'll tell you how much harder you need to work to counterbalance. Maybe you do a few more breathing exercises. Maybe you spend a little bit more time with a good friend that just is really supportive and holds space for you. There's a thousand other things that you could do, but intentionally counterbalance. So those are, I think, the most impactful foundational things that you could do.
Okay, Eric, we're gonna have you back because there's 1,000 more questions that I want to ask you, and that those foundational pieces are so key. They are absolutely the things that I talk about in my practice as well. And I really loved what you said about counterbalance in stress management because being in this stage myself, I sometimes it's challenging for me to talk about stress management, particularly when I'm facilitating sessions and I have a room of educators in front of me, or I have a room of caregivers in front of me and talking to them about stress management. I just did a session for educators in June, and June is the most stressful month there is. And we sometimes think that the stress management strategies have to be these big, things that are really challenging to work into our day. And instead of doing that counterbalancing when we're in that stress state, we just sort of like dive deeper into the stress. And so that counterbalance idea of when I am feeling really stressed, that is when I need to give myself more time, but it doesn't have to be big. Like those suggestions of box breathing, of, simple strategies that I can actually do in a moment, or that, connection with another human. Things that just fill us up and that feel good. And in those times when our stress levels are higher, we need to do even more of that. I think is a message that is really key because we tend to do the opposite.
One of the things that drives stress, Lisa, is all the what ifs in life. People's anxiety goes up because they start worrying, well, what if this happens? And what if that happens? What ifs will eat your lunch? But I have come to know, partly because I did a lot of training in cognitive behavioral therapy, when it comes to anxiety, it's like a kite. The only thing that keeps a kite aloft, aside from the wind, is tension on the string. And if you let go of the string, the kite falls to the earth eventually. And anxiety is like that. If the brain perceives justification to keep anxiety up, then it'll do the hard work to keep your sympathetic nervous system all revved up. But the way that you let go of the string with anxiety is actually to live in the gray and to accept uncertainty. When you get comfortable being uncomfortable, you become unstoppable. And that's not my words. That actually comes from a good friend of mine who's a mindset coach for professional athletes. But I think it's a truth. At least it's been true in my life. And when someone is saying, well, what if this and what if that? The answer to let go of the kite string is maybe possible. It could happen. And now that anxiety doesn't have anything to sink its teeth into because you're embracing the fact that, yeah, it could happen. If someone's saying, well, what if I die? The answer is maybe. In fact, the number one cause of death is birth. So we can just get over that one. We know it's going to happen at some point. Let's not be afraid to live because we're afraid to die because death is guaranteed. So, okay, maybe I'll die. Okay. Yeah, I can sit with that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That I really learned that lesson in the fall. So 2024 was quite a year in my family's world. I'm starting a new business, left a career. We ended up selling every property that we owned. We moved to a new city. My husband started a new job because we moved. Both my kids started university in September at the same time. And underlying all of that, I was caring for my dad who had Parkinson's, and then he passed away. So all of that happened between April and October of 2024. And I was holding onto the string very tightly, and those what if questions were constant. And what being on the other side of that really big, a massive kite and big string, that is absolutely what I learned. Was that all of the what ifs and the fear that I was experiencing through that only made the experience more intense. And now knowing that the truth of it is we don't really know. we don't know how things are going to play out. We make the best decisions we can in the moment, but that living in the what if and in the disaster state made everything harder. And now I know going forward, I now have strategies for myself of how to do that differently. But yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for everything that you have shared with our audience today. There is so much really important information, practical strategies, things to think about, and I really would love to have you back because I think there's a lot more that we can dig into, particularly in those foundational strategies. So Eric, thank you so much for being here today. I so appreciate your time and wisdom.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I'm happy to come back. You asked such good questions, and I love the conversation. So, anytime.
Hey everyone. Thanks for joining me on this week's episode of Transforming 45. I hope you feel inspired, empowered, and ready to embrace every facet of your midlife journey. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. These actions make a world of difference in growing our podcast community. Your support helps us reach much more amazing listeners just like you. And don't forget, please share an episode you love with a friend or with your community. Sharing our stories is what helps our community grow. Keep shining your midlife magic, and I'll catch you next week.
Electricast.